Everyday stuff that you and I experience, stuff like frustration and disappointment, anxiety, fear, insecurity, stress, sadness, my ongoing struggle with myself, my ongoing struggle with other people, my ongoing struggle with God, my ongoing struggle with circumstances. All of that is suffering too. It's not just the big stuff. It's not just big tragedies and catastrophes. It's all of that stuff. Relational strain, loneliness, this nagging sense of not enoughness, the feeling of being misunderstood, the feeling of being rejected, even in the smallest ways, it's all suffering. We all suffer. Pain is unavoidable. And it's been widely agreed on that there is no piece of literature that handles the problem of pain with more honesty and more realism than the biblical story of Job. Even people who don't believe in God, people who don't read the Bible, literary scholars admit that there is no place, there is no piece of literature that handles the problem of pain with more honesty and more realism than the biblical story of Job. It's a story about our suffering and God's sovereignty. It's a story about our pain and God's providence. It's about those intersections in life where our misery and God's mercy collide, where our grief and God's grace crash into each other, where catastrophe and compassion meet and wreck. It's about being a broken person living in a broken world with other broken people, but with a faithful God. It's about the fact that life is hard, that pain is real, but grace abounds. That's what the book of Job is about. That's what this story is about. We're going to look at chapters 1 and 2, but we're going to do this backwards, okay? And this is what I mean. Chapters 1 and 2 tell us what happened behind the curtain and then shows us how Job responds on stage. Okay, that's what happens. We get a peek, the reader, when we read chapter 1 and chapter 2, the reader gets a peek at the reason why Job is suffering, although Job never knows why he's suffering. Gets to the end of the book and he still has no clue why he suffered the tragedies that he suffered. He suffers a series of quick and major blows. He loses his wealth, he loses his children, he loses his reputation, he loses his health. I mean, he loses everything. The loss is catastrophic. And writhing in unimaginable agony, he tears his robe, he shaves his head, and he falls to the ground. All of those things are sort of ancient practices which symbolize extreme grief, deep and profound mourning, grief from places that you never knew you could grieve, grief in ways you didn't think you could grieve. There is no part of his life that is not completely wrecked, completely wrecked. He's absolutely undone. I would venture to say that there is no one in this room or no one watching online that has suffered these kinds of calamities in such quick succession. I mean, this is massive. All of his kids die in one fell swoop. He loses all of his money. He loses all of his property. He loses everything that made him who he was. I mean, this guy's lost it all. Lost it all. He's undone. And notice verse 22. Job's emotional outburst is not condemned. In fact, it's affirmed. Verse 22 says, in all of this, in all of the ways that Job has responded to these tragedies, to this suffering, to this pain, to this agony, in all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. So verse 22 affirms his emotional outburst. It doesn't condemn it. Sadness and grief and frustration and confusion in the face of pain and suffering is sanctioned by God. That's no small thing. It's okay to mourn. It's okay to express grief when you're suffering pain, to express frustration when you're experiencing something tragic. The Bible doesn't brush lightly over pain. Nowhere do we find God, anywhere in the Bible do we find God sanctioning a suck it up and deal with it posture toward hurt. Never. And at the end of verse 20, verse 20 says, then Job arose after hearing this news, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshiped. That makes no sense to me. Fell on the ground and worshiped. But then it gives us the content of his worship in verse 21. Look at what he says. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What's fascinating to me, and the reason that I bring this to your attention, is because the fact that it says at the end of verse 20, he worshiped, and then in verse 21 gives us the content of his worship, means that Job's grief is itself an act of worship. We don't typically think about grief in those ways. But Job's grief is actually an act of worship. Far from grieving being a lack of faith, grieving is actually an expression of faith. Grief involves a distant memory of what once was and a cry for what will one day be a universal reality once again. A world without pain and disease and conflict and death. A world without suffering. To grieve is an act of worship. It's a statement of faith that one day things won't be this way. See, the Bible says that God made all things good. We read that in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, that God made all things good. And then Genesis chapter 3 makes it clear that we then broke every good thing God made. But then the rest of the Bible is God's unfolding promise that he is in the process of making all things new, so that the best is yet to come. Well, underneath our grief is a cry for that day. We may not know it, we may not be conscious of it, but that's what grief is. It's a realization, it's a recognition that this shouldn't be happening. It's a recognition that this world is broken. I am broken. People in this world are broken. It wasn't always like this, and it won't always be like this. Underneath our grief is a cry for that day when we will enjoy sinless hearts and minds along with disease-free bodies, when all that causes us pain and discomfort will be destroyed, and we will be able to enjoy what is most enjoyable with unbounded energy and passion forever. There is so much more going on when you're grieving than what you think. It is an act of worship because it's an acknowledgement that things aren't the way they should be. And it is fueled by an anticipation that one day everything sad will come untrue.